Spring Story. It was the most beautiful morning. The spring sunshine crept into every cottage along Bramley Hedge, and the little windows in the trees were opened wide. All the mice were up early, but earliest of all was Wilfred, who lived with his family in the hornbeam tree. It was Wilfred's birthday. Jumping out of bed, he ran into his parents' room and bounced on their bed until I gave him their presents.
The kitchen table.
Happy birthday, they ate their toast and jam and listened to Wilfred's warbling. "I think somebody needs a lesson from the blackbird," said Mr. Apple, brushing the crumbs from his whiskers and putting on his coat. Mr. Apple was a nice, old-fashioned sort of mouse. He was warden of the store stump, where all the food for Bramley Hedge was kept. The store stump was not far away. As Mr. Apple walked happily through the grass to the big front doors, he felt someone pull on his tail. He turned around quickly. It was Wilfred, whistle in hand.
"We can find.
It's my birthday!" In the middle of the stump was an enormous hall, and leading off from it many passages and staircases. These led in turn to dozens of storerooms full of nuts and honey and jams and pickles. Each one had to be inspected. Wilfred's legs felt tired by the time they had finished, and he sat by the fire in the hall to rest. Mr. Apple lifted down a jar of sugared violets. He made a little cornet from a twist of paper and filled it with sweets. Taking Wilfred by the paw, he led him through the dark corridors out into the sun. Wilfred went to look for his brother, and Mr. Apple hurried down the hedge to visit his daughter Daisy and her husband, Lord Woodmouse. Lord and Lady Woodmouse lived in the old oak palace in the middle of the hedge. From the outside, the palace looks like an ordinary oak tree, but inside the trunk was hollowed out. The flow of the water turned the wheels which ground the flour and churned the butter for Bramley Hedge. Poppy Eyebright looked after the dairy stump. She supervised the large vat into which milk, kindly given by some cows, was poured and stored. The many kitchens, where cheeses were drained and shaped, smoked and wrapped, were also in her care. But they decided the wedding should take place on the stream. It was the coolest place, and besides, it was very romantic. Dusty found a large, flat piece of bark up in the woods, which a party of mice carried down to the water's edge.
The Tale of the Flopsy Bunnies by Beatrix Potter. It is said that the effect of eating too much lettuce is soporific. I have never felt sleepy after eating lettuces, but then I am not a rabbit. They certainly had a very soporific effect on the Flopsy Bunnies. When Benjamin Bunny grew up, he married his cousin Flopsy. They had a large family, and they were very improvident and cheerful. I do not remember the separate names of their children. They were generally called
She
the
rustled
Flopsy
across the
Bunnies
paper bag
and awakened Benjamin Bunny. The mouse apologised profusely and said that she knew Peter Rabbit. While she and Benjamin were talking, close under the wall, they heard a heavy tread above their heads, and suddenly Mr. McGregor emptied out a sack full of lawn mowings right upon the top of the sleeping Flopsy Bunnies. Benjamin shrank down under his paper bag. The mouse hid in a jam pot. They watched him go into his house, and then they crept up to the window to listen. Mr. McGregor threw down the sack on the stone floor in a way that would have been extremely painful to the Flopsy Bunnies if they had happened to be inside it. They could hear him drag his chair on the flags and chuckle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said Mr. McGregor. Eh? What's that? What have they been spoiling now? Inquired Mrs. McGregor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little fat rabbits, repeated Mr. McGregor, counting on his fingers. 1, 2, 3. Don't you be silly. What do you mean, you silly old man? In the sack.
At last the sun began to sink far behind the woods, and a chilly breeze blew over the field. It was time to go home. When the moon came up that night, Bramley Hedge was silent and still. Every mouse was fast asleep.